Imagine going to an ATM, expecting to withdraw money, only to discover a glitch in the system that lets you take out cash that doesn't even exist in your account. What would you do in this situation? Assuming you're a truthful and trustworthy person, the right thing would be to report the glitch and not exploit it for personal gain. But what if the person who discovered it wasn't so scrupulous? What if they didn't mind taking other people's money? This is the story we're diving into today. How one person exploited a glitch for months, eventually becoming a millionaire, only to be exposed in the most unexpected way. Our story begins in 2011 in Australia, with a man named Dan Sanders, who lived in Melbourne, one of the country's biggest cities. Dan worked at a casino, a place where gambling and drinking went hand in hand. People came to place bets and, inevitably, knock back drinks. It was a lifestyle that Dan knew well, and it shaped his world. But it was through this job that he met the woman who would eventually become his fiancée. However, she moved to a smaller city, Wangara, with a population of around 30,000. Dan, attached to her, followed her there. He needed to find new work, of course, so he took on various jobs, everything from cleaning to waiting tables, before finally landing a gig at a local pub. One evening in 2011, after finishing his shift at the bar and closing up, Dan did what he usually did. He went out for a drink with his close friend, Mark. Dan spent the evening in a bar, enjoying their drinks. When it got late, Mark decided to head home, leaving Dan alone. By now, it was well past midnight, and Dan was ready to call it a night. But when he went to pay for his drinks, he realized that his wallet was empty. Mark had left, and Dan was stuck without cash. So, Dan stepped out of the bar and started looking for an ATM. After a short walk, he found one belonging to the National Australia Bank, his bank. It was now 12:10 a.m. Pay attention to the time because it'll be important later. Dan had two cards, one for his savings account and one for his credit card. He first tried the savings card, but it had a zero balance. With nothing left, he pulled out the credit card. Most of you probably know how these cards work. They let you borrow money from the bank, but there's a limit. Dan's limit was $2,000, and he knew he was close to it. He had been maxing out the card all month. Still, he decided to check. He inserted the credit card, and sure enough, the balance showed a negative $1,995, just $5 before hitting the limit. But, in a moment of drunken impulse, Dan decided to try transferring $200 from the credit card to the savings account. He entered the amount and hit confirm. The ATM, of course, should have rejected the transaction. The credit card was near its limit, and there was no way to transfer more than what was available. Sure enough, an error message appeared, and the ATM spit the credit card back out. Any rational person would have walked away at that point, realizing that a transfer from an overdrawn credit card wasn't possible. But Dan, drunk and not thinking clearly, inserted the savings card to check if the $200 had somehow made it into the account. Strangely, the ATM didn't show the balance. It just said, "Account balance cannot be displayed at the moment." Dan was confused, but he didn't stop. Instead of walking away, he decided to try withdrawing $200. He pressed the button, and the machine dispensed $200 in cash. How did that happen? Dan had just tried transferring the same amount and received an error. Yet, here was the cash. The money had come from nowhere, and Dan, still drunk, wasn't thinking about the implications. He was just thrilled to have the cash. So he took the $200 and went back to the bar to continue drinking. The time now was 12:50 a.m., almost 1 a.m. After a few more drinks, he left the bar and headed home. It was raining heavily, and Dan was looking for shelter. He found himself standing in front of the same ATM, the one that had just given him $200. This time, the machine had a cover, offering him some protection from the downpour. While standing there, Dan began to wonder how it was possible for the machine to give him money when it shouldn't have. How had the transaction gone through? What had happened? In a foggy haze, he decided to test the system again. He took out his savings card and inserted it. Sure enough, no balance showed up. He tried the same steps again, transferred money from his credit card, received the error message, and had the card spit out. But when he inserted his savings card again and pressed for a withdrawal, the machine gave him $200 again. This time, Dan wasn't thinking about whether it made sense. He was thinking about getting more cash. He repeated the process several times. $400, $800, $2,000. Each time, the ATM dispensed the money, despite the fact that his accounts were nearly empty. By the end of the night, Dan had withdrawn around $2,000 and had a full wallet. Exhausted, he went home and immediately passed out. The next morning, Dan woke up, trying to piece together the events from the night before. Initially, he thought it was a dream. But when he opened his wallet and saw the $2,000 inside, he realized it had all been real. Surprised, he checked his bank balances. His savings account still showed zero, and his credit card balance still reflected the negative $1,995, as it had before. The system hadn't registered the withdrawals yet. Dan decided to wait. He figured the bank would notice something strange and call him. But the day passed without a word. The next morning, he checked his account again. This time, there was a surprise. His savings account now had a negative balance of $22,000, and his credit card still reflected a negative $1,995. The system had corrected itself. The money he had withdrawn was now a debt in his account. Dan still had the $2,000 in cash, and although he knew he should return it to the bank, he figured, why not keep the money in hand? After all, it was better than the nothing in his savings account. He bought a few things: house items, a new fridge, and even invited his friends to the bar to celebrate. By the end of the night, though, he was down to just $300. Dan didn't stop there. Instead of paying off his debt, he gambled the $300, hoping to win enough to cover the deficit. Horse racing betting was popular in bars, and Dan, having worked in one, knew the ropes. He placed his bets through a website connected to the bar's system. But in the end, Dan lost it all, every last cent. Now, Dan was stuck with even more debt. The thought of what had happened that night, how he had withdrawn money that wasn't in his account, nagged at him. He wasn't a hacker, but he had an interest in systems and how they worked. He began to analyze the factors surrounding that night, the timing, the glitch. There was something to it. The next morning, Dan woke up early and checked his account balance at 6 a.m. And there it was. The number had changed. His account now showed a positive balance of $4,000. It meant the system had reversed both of his midnight transfers. The $2,000 he withdrew on the first night and the $2,000 on the second were both wiped clean. It was as if they never happened. At first glance, this didn't seem very useful. Sure, Dan could take out money at night, but eventually the system would catch up. It always corrected itself after a day, and once the balance went too far into the negatives, the bank would definitely notice. In fact, the National Australia Bank had a safeguard. If an account balance dropped to negative $20,000, the system would automatically freeze it. But here's where the glitch came into play. The correction process took over 24 hours. Dan realized something crucial. There was a 1-hour window every night when the ATMs were disconnected from the bank's main system. Between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., the ATM entered a kind of standby mode. Transfers during this time didn't sync with the main system until much later. That was the glitch. It meant that during that 1 hour, Dan could transfer money from his credit card to his savings account, and the system wouldn't register the negative balance until the following day. If he did this every night, and each time transferred double the previous night's withdrawal, he could stay ahead of the system. Let's break that down with an example. On night 1, he withdraws $10,000. On night 2, before withdrawing again, he transfers $20,000. That covers the $10K from night 1 and gives him another $10,000 to spend. On night 3, he has to transfer $30,000 to make up for the last 2 withdrawals and continue the cycle. The amount he needed to transfer each night kept increasing, but the ATM allowed transfers of up to 6 figures in one go. If he wanted more, he could just initiate another transfer. But this trick had one critical condition. Dan could not miss a single night. If he missed even one midnight transfer, all the previously withdrawn amounts would hit his account at once as a massive negative balance. Say he had taken out $100,000 over the past few nights, he'd instantly owe that full amount. The system would freeze his account, and the bank would be on him. So, every night between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., Dan had to visit an ATM, transfer money, and stay one step ahead of the correction system. It was a fragile system, but it worked. And Dan stuck to it like clockwork. He could do it at any ATM owned by NAB, so each night he'd sneak out to perform the ritual. At first, he felt guilty, but he justified it to himself. Banks were greedy corporations that made billions off people. If he found a loophole in their system, wasn't he just beating them at their own game? He told no one. Not his friends, not even his fiancée, which was ironic, because she was a devout Christian, a primary school religious teacher, and would have never accepted what he was doing. Every night, while she slept peacefully, Dan was outside working the glitch. In that first week alone, he withdrew around $20,000. He spent most of it on drinks and gambling, especially horse betting, his favorite vice. His friends, unknowingly supporting his habit, helped him pick horses to bet on. Dan was living large. At the bar where he worked, he became a local legend, buying everyone drinks, covering entire tabs, and living like he hit the lottery. People started to wonder how he could afford all this. His paycheck certainly didn't match the lifestyle. He claimed he was on a winning streak at the races, and everyone believed it. But the truth was darker. Dan was losing. A lot. He was gambling every spare second, even during shifts at the bar. He used the Tats Group's TAB website, Australia's biggest betting platform, and over time he racked up $40,000 in losses. Eventually, his gambling drew attention. The Tabby website's management contacted the bar. Dan was supposed to collect customer bets, secure the money in a safe, and place the wagers online. But now he was betting with huge amounts, far more than what any customer submitted. They suspected he was skimming from the safe. The bar owner confronted him, but upon checking, all the money was accounted for. The owner was baffled. Dan was just an employee with a modest salary. So where was all this money coming from? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was suspicion. The betting site closed Dan's account, banning him permanently. The bar owner fired him. Rumors swirled. People assumed the worst. Drug dealing, theft, maybe even fraud. News traveled fast. And it reached the one person Dan didn't want it to, his fiancée. She ended it over a text, said she didn't know what he was into, but she wanted nothing to do with it. Dan was shattered. He needed to talk to someone. So, he called his best friend, Mark, and confessed everything. He told Mark about the glitch, the money, the withdrawals, everything. Mark listened quietly. He didn't want to be involved, but he promised their friendship wouldn't change. Then Dan suggested a trip to Melbourne, all expenses paid. Mark said, "Why not?" They took a train to the city. Dan booked them into Crown Towers, one of the most luxurious five-star hotels in Melbourne. He stood in front of their massive suite window overlooking the skyline. For the first time, he felt wealthy, like he belonged. But even that night, he snuck out to the nearest ATM at midnight. The cycle couldn't stop. The next day, Dan and Mark hit the casino. They gambled recklessly, throwing down thousands of dollars, losing more than most people earned in a year. Dan didn't care. Mark eventually returned home for work, but Dan stayed. Melbourne was paradise, and now he had money to enjoy it. But ATMS had limits. No matter how much he had in his account, which had now reached over $500,000, the machines could only give so much. So Dan made a bold move. He walked into a bank. It was risky, too risky. What if they flagged his account? What if the police showed up? To test the waters, he kept it small. The first time, he asked for $1,000 just to see their reaction. It went smoothly. Then he asked for $11,000. The banker processed it without issue and casually mentioned, "You've got $537,027 in your account." Dan replied, "Thanks," but inside, he was panicking. A few days later, he tried $20,000. No problem. Then, the big one, $100,000. This time, the banker stepped away for about 15 minutes. Dan's heart pounded. Were they calling the police? Had the system caught on? But finally, the banker returned and handed him the full $100,000 in cash. Now, Dan was unstoppable. He could withdraw any amount he wanted directly from the bank. Still, he knew it wouldn't last forever. Every day he expected a knock on the hotel door, a call from the bank, the sirens. So he leaned in. He called his friends, including Mark, and invited them all to Melbourne. He promised luxury hotels, fine dining, shopping sprees, parties, and more. Some of them were suspicious, but they came anyway. There were 4 of them in total. Dan told 2 of them the full story. The third didn't want to know. He just wanted to enjoy the ride. And ride they did. They traveled in limousines, flew in helicopters, and turned hotel suites into nightclubs. Dan would walk into a restaurant and tell the staff, "Everything's on me. Everyone here eats and drinks for free." He rented entire pools, penthouses, even full hotel floors just to throw parties. There were dancing, drinks, girls, drugs, the full fantasy. Anyone who crossed paths with Dan was showered in generosity. Waiters got $100 tips. Limo drivers were given more than their daily wages. Hotel staff treated like royalty. And his friends? He paid off their debts, even their university loans. He was the king of Melbourne. But kings built on secrets don't rule forever. Dan wasn't just spending money. He was rewriting the rules of generosity. One day, he saw a street musician playing for spare change. No one was watching. So Dan paid people to stand around and cheer him on. Then he dropped thousands into the musician's case. Another time, at a restaurant, he overheard an elderly couple talking about their dream trip to Hawaii. But they couldn't afford it, so they were settling for something local. Dan handed them $40,000 in cash, no questions asked. Whenever he met someone homeless, he didn't just give them food or a blanket. He booked them into 5-star hotels. Once, the Hilton called him. One of the people Dan helped had stolen the towels, the iron, even the coffee machine. Dan just laughed and said, "Don't worry, I'll pay for it." He believed the money would never run out. And if that was true, why not share it? But Dan wasn't just a modern-day Robin Hood. He lived large, too. He and his friends splurged on designer clothes, luxury perfumes, and gourmet dinners. They couldn't roll into fancy venues dressed like nobodies. They had to look like they belonged. At one point, Dan dined at one of Melbourne's most expensive restaurants and paid the bill for everyone there. A waitress approached him afterward and asked, "Are you the richest man in Australia?" Dan smiled. "No, I think I'm seventh." Women were drawn to his wealth. Dan was generous. He gifted them clothes, jewelry, luxury. But if he sensed anyone trying to take advantage of him, he walked away without hesitation. Despite the extravagance, there was always one rule: never miss a transfer. Every night before midnight, Dan had to make sure the ATM glitch kept feeding his account. He set alarms. If he missed even one day, the whole system could collapse. In just 4 months, he withdrew over $1.6 million, and the bank had no idea. Once, he rented a private jet for $90,000, flew to an island near Bali, and rented the entire thing for a weekend. To keep the system going while he was away, he gave his bank cards to a friend, who handled the nightly transfers. But no amount of money could silence the fear. Dan knew it wouldn't last. Every day, he waited for the bank or police to come knocking. He couldn't sleep. He drank to forget. The anxiety was crushing. One night, he'd had enough. He gathered his 3 closest friends and told them it was over. They were shocked, furious. But Dan was done living on the edge. He made one final transfer and told them, "Take whatever you want, cash, clothes, anything." And just like that, the operation ended. Total damage, $1.6 million. Dan checked into a hotel with $80,000 in cash. He dumped it all in the bathtub. Then he waited, for the police, for the call. Days passed. Then the phone rang. It was the bank. "We've noticed some unusual activity," the voice said. Dan played dumb. "I don't know. You tell me." "We'll investigate. If you've done something wrong, we'll inform the police. And don't even think about running." Dan waited. No raid, no follow-up, just silence. A month later, he called the bank. After 20 minutes on hold, someone named Bernie picked up. "You're not getting any more money," Bernie said coldly. Dan replied, "I'm not trying to. I just want to know what's going on." "You're a bad boy," Bernie snapped. "You're going to jail." Still, nothing happened. No arrest, no court case, just vague threats over the phone. Dan returned to his small hometown, Wangara. Still, he waited. 1 year passed, then 2. Nothing. Lawyers couldn't help. The case was too strange, too unique. No one knew what to do with it. Eventually, in early 2014, Dan hit a breaking point. He wasn't free. He wasn't locked up. He was living in limbo, so he told everyone. He contacted one of the biggest newspapers in Australia and shared everything. They suited him up, flew him on a private jet, took sleek photos and wrote the story. But the article didn't make waves. The bank didn't flinch. So Dan took it further. He contacted A Current Affair, one of Australia's most watched TV shows. They loved it. They filmed a week-long feature, hotels, cars, planes, reenactments of Dan's 4-month heist. Dan was sure this would get the bank to finally react. When the episode aired, Dan sat back and watched. It told his story, but ended with a twist. The host looked into the camera and said, "Dan Sanders is now a wanted man. There is an arrest warrant. If you know where he is, contact the police." Dan stared at the screen. What? He wasn't hiding. He had filmed with them for a full week. Now he was suddenly a fugitive? Later that night, one of the producers emailed him, thanking him, calling him a pleasure to work with, and inviting him to pick up his photos at the station the following Thursday. Dan knew it was a trap, but he was tired of running. So he went. As soon as he walked into the station, cameras everywhere. Then, a police officer walked up and said, "You're under arrest." That was the ending they wanted. Cameras rolling. The perfect final scene. But here's the twist. The officer wasn't even investigating the case. He was just a friend of the producer, brought in for the show. There was no investigation, no formal charges. The bank had never even reported the crime to the police. Why? Because admitting it would destroy them. If the public found out someone exploited their system for over $1 million, confidence would collapse. Stock prices would plummet. They'd lose far more than the money Dan took. So they stayed quiet and let Dan walk free until he brought it all into the spotlight. To this day, Dan continues to tell his story on podcasts, in interviews on YouTube. And that was the true story of Dan Sanders. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe our channel.